The air in the courtroom was heavy, a suffocating mix of polished wood, old books, and quiet tension. Rows of people sat on hard benches, whispering in hushed voices as they stole glances at the girl who had just walked in. She was young, too young to be standing at the defendant's table, but there she was, chin high, eyes steady, exuding a quiet confidence that did not match the nervous energy radiating from those around her. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting a harsh glow on the courtroom, making every wrinkle on the judge's face more pronounced as he leaned back in his seat, assessing the girl with a smirk that barely hid his contempt. Judge. Marshall was an old man who had seen his fair share of cases, and in his mind he had seen enough to know exactly how this one would go. A black teenager, barely out of high school, standing in his courtroom as if she had any real understanding of the law. The very idea was laughable. He had presided over too many cases to entertain such absurdity. He tapped his gavel twice, more, out of amusement than necessity, and leaned forward, peering at the girl over the rim of his glasses. "And you are?" His voice dripped with condescension, dragging out the words as if he were addressing a child who had mistakenly wandered. Into the courtroom, the girl met his gaze without hesitation. "My name is Maya Brooks." Her voice was even, calm, deliberate. Judge Marshall arched an eyebrow. "And what exactly are you doing standing there, Miss Brooks?" He chuckled under his breath, shaking his head as he glanced at the bailiff. The man beside him smirked as well, as if in on some private joke. Maya did not blink. "I am here to represent my client." The room fell silent. A ripple of surprise moved through the spectators, whispers rising like a wave before quickly dying. "Down." A few exchanged puzzled looks, others scoffed under their breath. Judge Marshall leaned back in his chair, pressing his fingers together as he studied her. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "This is not a school debate club, Miss Brooks. This is a court of law. If this is some kind of joke, I suggest you think very carefully before wasting my time." The corners of Maya's lips twitched, but she held back the smirk threatening to form. She knew this reaction all too well. The disbelief, the mocking undertones, the dismissive glances. It was nothing new. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I have every right to be here," she said, her voice unwavering. Judge Marshall scoffed, looking toward the prosecution as if expecting someone to correct the absurdity unfolding in front of him. "Who put you up to this?" He looked back at Maya, narrowing his eyes. "Where is the real attorney representing the defendant?" Maya inhaled slowly, steadying herself. "I am the attorney." A beat of silence, then laughter, low, scattered. Chuckles from the jury box, a few muffled snickers from the back of the room. Even the clerk shook his head, pretending to be busy with his papers. Judge Marshall exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples as if trying to ward off a headache. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath before pinning his gaze back on her. "Young lady, this is not a game. You may have watched a few legal dramas on television, but that does not make you a lawyer." Maya's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "Your Honor, I passed the bar exam." More murmurs. The whispering grew louder this time, confusion and disbelief rippling through the crowd. Judge Marshall's smirk faltered just slightly before returning, but there was an edge to his voice now, something sharp beneath the amusement. "Impossible." Maya reached into her briefcase, pulling out a neatly folded document. She took 2 steps forward, placed it on the judge's bench, and stepped back. He stared at her for a long moment before reluctantly reaching for the paper. His eyes flicked across the words, his expression darkening as he read. His fingers curled tightly around the document, knuckles whitening. His throat bobbed. This must be some kind of mistake." But there was no mistake. The words were there, in plain print. Maya Brooks had passed the bar. She was, by every legal standard, a practicing attorney. The room was dead silent. Now, All the laughter had drained from the faces of those who had mocked her just minutes before. Even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably, looking down as if suddenly interested in his own shoes. The air had changed, thick with something indescribable, part shock, part unease. Maya did not say anything. She just stood there, watching the judge's face as he processed what had just been placed in front of him. He looked up, his jaw tightening, his fingers pressing against the document as if trying to will it into something else. He cleared his throat. "Miss Brooks," he said, his voice now lacking its earlier amusement. "If you are truly a lawyer, then I assume you know how to conduct yourself properly in this court." Maya lifted her chin, her voice steady. "Of course, Your Honor." Judge Marshall's expression was unreadable, but something flickered. In his eyes, something that was not quite anger, but not quite acceptance either. He tapped his gavel lightly, the sound echoing in the silence. "Very well," he said slowly. "Proceed." The words hung in the air like a challenge, unspoken yet deafening. Maya stepped forward, setting her notes on the table, her fingers brushing over the pages with practiced ease. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, but she had been preparing for this her entire life. She knew exactly what she was doing. What she did not know, however, was that Judge Marshall was not about to let her off so easily. His pride had been wounded, and there was nothing more dangerous than a man desperate to prove himself right. And Maya, she was about to learn just how deep that desperation ran. Maya could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on her, some curious, others skeptical, a few outright hostile. She had expected this reaction. No one ever believed she belonged. Not at first. It had been this way her entire life, people assuming she was too young, too inexperienced, or most often simply out of place. But she had learned how to navigate these moments, how to stand tall when the world tried to make her feel small. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself before shifting her attention to the prosecution. A tall man in his late 40s stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Jonathan Whitaker was a seasoned prosecutor, known for his relentless style and his disdain for defense attorneys who wasted his time. He had prepared for a fight today, but he had not expected to go up against a teenager. "Miss Brooks," Whitaker said, his voice smooth but edged with disbelief. "I assume you are prepared to defend your client?" Maya met his gaze. "I would not be standing here if I was not." A slight smirk tugged at the corner of Whitaker's mouth, but it was not amusement. It was the kind of smirk that said, "Let's see how long you last." Judge Marshall cleared his throat. "Let us proceed." Maya turned to her client, a young man named Elijah Carter. He was barely 20, accused of a robbery he swore he did not commit. His public defender had dropped his case at the last minute, claiming there was no hope. That was when Maya had stepped in. Elijah shifted in his seat, his voice low. "You really a lawyer?" Maya gave him a small nod. "Yes." Elijah exhaled, shaking his head. "Man, they're gonna eat you alive in here." She smiled faintly. "Let them try." As the prosecution began laying out its argument, Maya's mind drifted back to where this all started. She had been raised by a single mother, a woman who had worked double shifts at a diner just to keep food on the table. Life had never been easy. She had grown up hearing that the world was not fair, especially not to girls like her. But her mother had never let her use that as an excuse. "You don't have to fight every battle," her mother had once told her, wiping sweat from her forehead after another long shift. "But you better be ready to fight the ones that matter." And this mattered. Maya had always been different. While other kids played outside, she spent her time at the library, devouring every book she could find. By the time she was 14, she had finished reading most of the legal textbooks her town's library had to offer. It was an escape, but also a weapon. She knew knowledge was power, and she had every intention of using it. The first time she Told a teacher she wanted to be a lawyer, they had laughed. You have to be realistic, Maya, they had said, as if ambition was something reserved for others. But Maya had never accepted the limitations people tried to place on her. She had skipped grades, taken the bar exam as soon as she was eligible, and passed, and now here she was. She forced herself back to the present as Whitaker continued speaking. The evidence is overwhelming, he said smoothly. Surveillance footage places Mr. Carter at the scene of the crime. The fingerprints, the stolen merchandise, found in his apartment. He turned to the jury, pausing for effect. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a mystery. This is a case of cause and effect. A crime was committed, and the man responsible is sitting right there. Maya stood, adjusting the cuffs of her blazer. Your Honor, if I may. Judge Marshall sighed. Let us hear what our young defense attorney has to say. Maya stepped forward. Mr. Whitaker makes a compelling argument, but there's something missing. She turned to the jury, making eye contact with each of them. A story. He's given you a neat and simple explanation, but reality is never that clean cut. She walked over to the evidence table, picking up a folder. Let's start with the fingerprints. The prosecution says they belong to my client. That is true, but what he did not tell you is that my client worked at the store in question up until a week before the robbery. A murmur moved through the jury, Maya continued. And the stolen merchandise? Found in his apartment. But do you know who else had access to that apartment? His roommate? A man with a prior record for theft. She let the words hang in the air. Whitaker's smirk faded slightly. He had underestimated her. Judge Marshall tapped his fingers against his desk. Miss Brooks, are you suggesting your client was framed? Maya met his gaze. I am suggesting that there is more to this case than meets the eye. The judge exhaled slowly. Proceed. Whitaker recovered quickly, standing with an almost lazy confidence. Nice speech, Miss Brooks, he said. But do you really believe a jury is going to buy that? Maya tilted her head. Do you believe a jury should accept an incomplete story? A flicker of irritation crossed his face. Maya could feel the momentum shifting, but she also knew this was just the beginning. At the back of the courtroom, a man in a dark suit watched her closely, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the arm of his chair. He had not spoken yet, but Maya had noticed him the moment she walked in. Something about him felt off. She pushed the thought aside for now. She had bigger problems to deal with. Judge Marshall leaned forward. Miss Brooks, if you are going to challenge the prosecution's argument, you better have something more than speculation. Maya's lips curved slightly. I wouldn't be here if I didn't. And then, just as she was about to continue, the courtroom door creaked open. A young woman rushed in, her face flushed with urgency. She made her way to the prosecution's table and whispered something into Whitaker's ear. His entire demeanor changed. His jaw clenched, his fingers tightening around his pen. Maya watched carefully. Something was wrong. She did not know what had just happened, but whatever it was big. And she was going to find out. Maya's heart pounded as she watched Whitaker's expression shift. The whisper from the young woman had drained the color from his face. He masked it quickly, but not before she caught the flicker of unease in his eyes. Whatever had just been said, it had rattled him. She turned her attention back to her client, Elijah. He was watching her closely now, searching her face for a sign, something to tell him that she was still in control. She gave him the smallest nod, reassuring him even though a part of her wondered what was unfolding behind the scenes. Judge Marshall sighed impatiently. Is there something you'd like to share with the court, Mr. Whitaker? Whitaker forced a smirk, shaking his head, as he straightened his tie. No, Your Honor, just some minor administrative matters. Maya narrowed her eyes. Liar. She had spent years studying the way people spoke, the way their words and their body language often told two different stories. Right now, Whitaker was saying everything was fine. but the way he was gripping his pen, the stiffness in his jaw, those told a different story. She needed to press him. "Mr. Whitaker," she said smoothly, stepping forward, "you just presented the jury with your version of events, one that conveniently places my client as the culprit. But if your case is so airtight, why do you suddenly seem uneasy?" A few jurors shifted, now eyeing Whitaker curiously. The courtroom had grown quieter, tension thick in the air. Whitaker's smile was tight. "Miss Brooks, this isn't a detective novel. There's no grand conspiracy here. The facts remain the same." Maya folded her arms. "And yet, someone just whispered something to you that made you hesitate." She tilted her head, her voice calm but sharp. "What are you hiding?" Whitaker's jaw clenched. He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this is absurd." Judge Marshall rubbed his temple. "Miss Brooks, unless you have actual evidence to suggest there's misconduct." "Funny you should say that." Maya reached into her briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. "Because I do." The room collectively inhaled. Whitaker's smirk vanished. She walked toward the bench, handing the folder to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. He flipped it open, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the contents. "What is this?" Judge Marshall muttered. Maya clasped her hands behind her back. "That, Your Honor, is security footage from the night of the robbery. The prosecution had already presented footage, but this was different. This was from an angle they had conveniently left out." The judge's brow furrowed as he continued reading. "Where did you get this?" Maya's expression remained neutral. "A concerned party." That was not a lie. The footage had been dropped off anonymously at her firm's office the night before. No note, no explanation, just a USB drive containing what was now the biggest crack in the prosecution's case. Whitaker finally found his voice. "This is highly irregular. The defense had ample time to submit evidence." Maya turned to him, raising an eyebrow. "Oh, I am sorry. Are you frustrated that I didn't withhold evidence like you did?" A few quiet murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Whitaker's face darkened. He wasn't laughing anymore. Judge Marshall looked between them, then back at the folder. He sighed heavily. "I will allow it." Whitaker opened his mouth to protest, but thought better of it. Instead, he shot Maya a look that was nothing short of murderous. She had just made an enemy. After the day's proceedings, Maya gathered her notes, stuffing them into her bag as the courtroom emptied. She could still feel the weight of Whitaker's glare on her, but she did not acknowledge him. Instead, she turned to Elijah. "You did good today," she said. Elijah exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face. "Man, I do not know how you do it." He shook his head. "That dude hates you." Maya smiled wryly. "That means I'm doing something right." Elijah leaned in slightly. "Do you think this'll be enough?" Her smile faded. "I think we just bought ourselves more time." Elijah nodded slowly. "I appreciate you, Maya. No one else was willing to fight for me." Maya felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She had seen too many cases like this. Young black men thrown into a system that had already decided their fate before they even stepped into the courtroom. She had promised herself a long time ago that she would be different. That night, Maya sat at her small apartment's desk, reviewing the footage again. The video clearly showed a masked figure entering the store, but something was off. She rewound, watching frame by frame, and then she saw it. Her breath caught. The person in the footage wasn't Elijah. The figure's build was different, broader, shoulders, a slightly hunched posture. It was someone else, and yet the prosecution had been so sure it was him. Her pulse quickened. Whitaker had to have known. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she called the number of a private investigator she had worked with before. "I need you to dig into Jonathan Whitaker," she said the moment he answered. A pause. Then, "That's a dangerous name to be looking into, Brooks. I don't care." There was a sigh on the other end. "All right, I'll see what I can find." Maya hung up, staring at the screen for a long moment. Something was not right, and she was going to find out what. The next morning, as she walked into the courthouse, she felt a shift in the air. People stared a little longer. The whispers were a little louder. Then she saw him, a man in a dark suit, the same one who had been watching her during the trial. He was leaning against the wall near the entrance, his expression unreadable. As she passed, he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "You're making powerful enemies, Miss Brooks." Maya slowed but did not stop. She turned her head slightly. "And who exactly are you?" The man smiled faintly. "Just someone who suggests you tread carefully." Maya held his gaze for a long moment before continuing into the courthouse. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. She had expected opposition, but this was something else, and she had the sinking feeling that she was about to uncover something much bigger than just one wrongful conviction. The moment Maya stepped into the courthouse, she knew something had shifted. The usual murmurs of curiosity that followed her were now tinged with something colder, skepticism, maybe even fear. She tightened her grip on her case files, ignoring the creeping unease curling in her stomach. Today was going to be different. Today, she was going to push Whitaker into a corner. As she approached the defense table, she could feel Whitaker's eyes on her, sharp and calculating. He sat with his arms folded, the usual smirk absent from his face. He had always been smug, but today there was something else beneath the surface, something tense, something desperate. She knew why. Maya's investigator had sent her a brief text that morning. "Found something. Watch your back." That was all. No details, no explanation, just a warning. And that alone told her everything she needed to know. Whitaker was hiding something, and whatever it was big. Judge Marshall entered, calling the court to order. Maya squared her shoulders, her mind racing through every detail of the case. "Miss Brooks, you may proceed with your defense." She stood, adjusting her blazer. "Your Honor, I would like to call a witness to the stand." Whitaker stiffened. His reaction was subtle, but she caught it. Judge Marshall raised an eyebrow. "A witness? At this stage?" Maya nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. A key witness who has information that will directly impact this case." She turned to the courtroom doors just as they swung open. A man walked in, tall, slightly unshaven, wearing a worn-out jacket. Maya felt the energy in the room shift. Whitaker's jaw clenched. The witness stepped forward, his gaze flicking nervously between Maya and the prosecutor's table. Judge Marshall eyed him warily. "And you are?" The man swallowed. My name's Darnell Cooper." His voice was rough, hesitant. I was there the night of the robbery." A ripple of murmurs spread through the spectators. Whitaker's fingers curled into fists. Maya turned to the jury, her voice calm but firm. "Mr. Cooper, can you tell us exactly what you saw?" Darnell shifted uncomfortably. I was outside the store that night. I saw someone go in, but it wasn't Elijah Carter." The air grew thick. Judge Marshall leaned forward. "You're saying the defendant was not the one who committed the crime?" Darnell nodded. "Yeah, the guy who did it was bigger, different build." He hesitated, glancing at Whitaker, then back at Maya. "And I think someone paid to keep quiet about it." The silence was deafening. Maya could feel Whitaker's fury from across the room. Judge Marshall cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitaker, do you have any response to this?" Whitaker stood slowly, his expression unreadable, but Maya could see the tension in his jaw, the barely controlled anger simmering just beneath his composed exterior. "This is hearsay," he said coolly. "We have no proof this man was even there that night," Maya smirked. "Actually, we do." She reached into her bag and pulled out a second folder. Whitaker's smirk vanished. Judge Marshall took the folder, flipping through the pages. His brows furrowed as he scanned the contents. "This—" He looked up. "Where did you get this?" Maya's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. "It's a sworn statement from an employee at the police evidence room." She turned to the jury. The original surveillance footage was altered before being submitted to the court, but the real footage still exists. Whitaker's face darkened. Judge Marshall exhaled, rubbing his temples. "This is serious," he muttered. "Tampering with evidence." Maya turned to Whitaker. "Who had access to that evidence, Mr. Whitaker?" Whitaker didn't answer, but he didn't have to. The weight of the revelation settled over the room like a thick fog. And then, just as Maya opened her mouth to press him further, the lights flickered, then went out. A few startled gasps echoed. Through the courtroom, the murmurs grew louder as the emergency lights kicked in, casting eerie, dim glows over the room. Maya's breath hitched. Something was wrong. She turned, instinctively scanning the room, and then a crash, a scream. The back doors of the courtroom slammed open, and Maya barely had time to process what was happening before the bailiff was shouting for order. Her pulse raced. Someone had just stormed out of the courthouse, and she had a sinking feeling she knew who it was. Whitaker was gone. Panic surged through her veins. He was running. Maya grabbed her bag, her mind spinning. Judge Marshall slammed his gavel. "We are in recess until further notice," but Maya wasn't listening. She was already pushing through the crowd, shoving past stunned onlookers as she bolted for the doors. She wasn't going to let him escape. Not now. Not when she was this close to the truth. Maya's pulse pounded as she pushed through the heavy courthouse doors and stepped into the blinding afternoon sun. Her eyes darted around, scanning the busy street. Cars honked, people bustled by, oblivious to the fact that a man who had just been exposed for tampering with evidence was now on the run. Then she saw him, Jonathan Whitaker. He was moving fast, weaving through pedestrians, his once perfect composure shattered. His suit jacket flapped behind him as he shoved past a man holding a coffee, nearly sending him sprawling onto the pavement. Maya didn't think. She just ran. Her breath came in sharp bursts as she chased him down the sidewalk, her heels pounding against the concrete. Every fiber of her being told her this was it. This was the moment that would decide everything. Whitaker glanced over his shoulder, his eyes wild with panic. He saw her gaining on him and made a sharp turn into an alley. Maya followed without hesitation. The alley was tight, the walls lined with graffiti, the stench of garbage thick in the air. Whitaker was fast, but Maya was fueled by something deeper, years of fighting to be taken seriously, of clawing her way into a system designed to shut her out, and she wasn't about to let him get away now. She lunged, grabbing the back of his jacket and yanking hard. Whitaker stumbled, his feet skidding against the pavement as he slammed into the brick wall. He whirled around, panting, his face slick with sweat. This is insane," he gasped. "You have no idea what you're getting into." Maya steadied herself, chest heaving. "I think I have a pretty good idea." Whitaker ran a shaking hand through his disheveled hair. "You don't understand. This case, this whole thing, there are people involved who will bury you if you keep digging." Maya narrowed her eyes. "Then why are you running?" Whitaker's mouth opened, but no words came out. His silence was all the confirmation she needed. She took a slow step forward. "You framed Elijah Carter. You tampered with evidence. You tried to send an innocent man to prison to protect someone." She folded her arms. "Who?" Whitaker hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Judge Marshall." Maya froze. For a moment she was sure she had misheard, but the look in Whitaker's eyes told her she hadn't. A slow, suffocating realization settled over her. Judge Marshall, the very man who had been treating her with condescension from the start, was behind all of this? Whitaker exhaled shakily, his gaze flickering toward the alley entrance. "I had no choice. He made me do it." Maya's mind spun. Explain. Whitaker swallowed hard. Elijah Carter was never supposed to be the suspect. He wiped sweat from his brow. The real perpetrator, Judge Marshall's son. The air seemed to thicken around her. She had suspected corruption, but this was bigger than she had ever imagined. Whitaker looked away. The judge knew the police were closing in on his son. The evidence pointed to him. But Marshall had power, influence. He let out a hollow laugh. More than me, more than anyone. He had the surveillance footage doctored, made sure Elijah's name replaced his son's in the system. He told me to prosecute as if my career depended on it. Maya's stomach twisted. She had spent the last few days fighting to prove Elijah's innocence, but she hadn't realized just how deep the corruption ran. Her breath steadied, her mind clearing. Judge Marshall. He had tried to humiliate her, mock her, make her feel like she didn't belong, but he had underestimated her. Maya squared her shoulders. You're going to confess. Whitaker let out a bitter chuckle. You think he's just going to let this happen? You think the police are going to arrest him? Maya held his gaze. They will if you have evidence. Whitaker hesitated. Then slowly he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times, then turned it toward her. A recording. She leaned in. The voice was unmistakable. Judge Marshall's. I don't care what you have to do. Make it disappear. You think anyone's going to believe a black kid? Over me, you make sure that trial ends the way it's supposed to, or your career is over. Maya felt a chill run down her spine. This was it. The proof. Whitaker let out a long breath. I kept it just in case. If he ever turned on me, I needed leverage. He swallowed. But it won't matter if he finds out we're talking right now. Maya straightened. Then we make sure we go public before he can bury this. Whitaker gave her a long, searching look. Then, finally, he nodded. 2 hours later, Maya stood outside the courthouse, her phone in her hand, her stomach twisting with anticipation. The press conference was set. Reporters had gathered. Cameras were flashing, microphones were waiting, and then, as if the universe itself had been waiting for this moment, Judge Marshall stepped out of the courthouse doors. The second he saw her, his expression darkened. He started toward her, his lips already forming a sneer. Miss Brooks, if this is some kind of... Maya raised her phone, pressing a button. The recording of his voice boomed through the speakers. You think anyone's going to believe a black kid over me? You make sure that trial ends the way it's supposed to, or your career is over. The crowd went still. The air felt electric. Judge Marshall's face drained of color. His mouth opened and closed, as if searching for a way to undo what had just happened. But there was no undoing this. Reporters erupted in questions. Cameras zoomed in. His name, once a symbol of authority, was now being shouted in scandal, and for the first time since she had entered his courtroom, Maya saw something new in his eyes. Fear. Whitaker stepped forward, his voice loud and clear. I was ordered to tamper with evidence. I was coerced into prosecuting an innocent man. I have proof. Another wave of gasps and camera flashes. Judge Marshall stumbled back, his face contorted in fury and panic. This is ridiculous. She's a child, a nobody. Maya lifted her chin. No, she said, her voice steady, unwavering. I'm an attorney. And for the first time, everyone finally saw her for exactly who she was. The courtroom scandal had exploded beyond anything Maya could have imagined. Within hours, the footage of Judge Marshall's recorded confession had gone viral. News stations played the audio on repeat, social media erupted with outrage, and legal analysts dissected every angle of the case. By the next morning, Judge Marshall was placed on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation. By noon, he had resigned, and by evening, law enforcement had officially announced a criminal inquiry into his actions. But Maya knew it wasn't over yet. She stood outside the courthouse, the cool breeze sweeping through her hair, exhaustion pressing heavily on her shoulders. Cameras still flashed, reporters still swarmed, but the frenzy was slowly shifting. For once, she wasn't the one being doubted. She was the one being believed. A few days later, Maya found herself in a familiar setting, the same courtroom, where she had been mocked, dismissed, underestimated. Only now things were different. She sat at the defense table, her posture strong but relaxed. Elijah Carter was beside her, fingers tapping against his knee as he stole glances around the room. He was still cautious, still wary, but for the first time in weeks, there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Judge Anita Reynolds, a replacement for Marshall, entered the courtroom, her expression unreadable. The tension was thick. The world had been watching this case, and today it would finally come to an end. Judge Reynolds cleared her throat, her gaze settling on Elijah. After reviewing the new evidence and considering the misconduct surrounding this case, it is the decision of this court that the charges against the defendant, Elijah Carter, are to be dismissed. A breathless silence filled the room, and then applause. Maya closed her eyes for a brief second, letting the weight of the moment sink in. She had done it. Elijah's mother, seated behind them, broke into quiet sobs, clutching her hands together. In relief, Elijah himself let out a breath he must have been holding in for days. Maya turned to him, smiling softly. "You're free." Elijah blinked rapidly, as if struggling to believe it. And then, without warning, he pulled her into a tight hug. "Thank you," he whispered, "for not giving up on me." Maya swallowed hard, emotion thick in her throat. "You never should have been here in the first place." She pulled back as Judge Reynolds continued. "As for Mr. Jonathan Whitaker—" She turned her gaze toward the prosecutor's table. Whitaker sat stiffly, his face devoid of its usual smugness. He looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of his choices had finally crushed him. "You have agreed to fully cooperate with the ongoing investigation into judicial misconduct," Judge Reynolds stated. "Your failure to uphold the integrity of this court has caused irreparable harm, and I trust that the appropriate authorities will see to it that justice is served." Whitaker nodded once. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't arguing. He was simply done. Maya exhaled. The fight was over, and she had won. That evening, she sat on the rooftop of her tiny apartment building, staring out at the city lights. It was quiet, peaceful. She should have been celebrating. She should have been thrilled. But all she felt was exhaustion. She had spent her entire life proving herself, proving she was smart enough, strong enough, capable enough, and yet even now, after exposing corruption at the highest level, she knew there were still people who would look at her and doubt her, because she was young, because she was a black woman, because the world had a way of moving the pulling out her phone every time she reached it. Her mother's name was at the top of her call log. None of that mattered. She hesitated. She had won a battle that mattered. After 2 rings, her mother's voice filled the silence. "Baby, I saw the news." Maya smiled, leaning back against the ledge. "Yeah?" Her mother let out a watery laugh. "Yeah, you did good, Maya. You did real good." Maya closed her eyes, a lump forming in her throat. For so long she had fought to prove herself to the world. But the only validation she had ever truly needed was right here, in her mother's voice. "I'm proud of you," her mother said softly. Maya swallowed past the emotion clogging her throat. "I'm proud of me too." And for the first time in a long time, she really truly was. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of the case spread far and wide. Judge Marshall was officially disbarred and faced multiple criminal charges, his career in ruins. The legal system was forced to confront its failures, with public pressure demanding reforms in how cases, especially those involving young black men, were handled. Maya's name was everywhere. Some called her a prodigy, others a troublemaker. She didn't care either way. She hadn't done this for recognition. She had done it because it was right. One afternoon, as she packed up her files at the law firm, her mentor, Attorney Jameson, leaned against her office door, watching her with a proud smile. "You know, Maya," he said, "you've got every major firm in the city reaching out to you. Offers are piling up." Maya smirked. "Let me guess. They all suddenly realized. I'm worth taking seriously?" Jameson chuckled. "Something like that." She exhaled, shaking her head. "I didn't do this to climb the ladder." "I know." He stepped forward. "So, what's next?" Maya glanced around her small office, then back at Jameson. "I think it's time I start my own firm." Jameson arched an eyebrow. "Ambitious," Maya grinned. "Always." He nodded, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "Then go build something great, Maya Brooks." And she would, because this was just the beginning. 1 year later, Maya stood in front of a modest glass building on the corner of a bustling city street. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the sidewalk as people hurried past, unaware of the history being made inside. She took a deep breath, staring at the bold black letters etched onto the glass door. Brooks and Carter Law Firm. She smiled, pressing her fingers against the lettering, feeling the weight of everything that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she had been underestimated, mocked, dismissed as nothing more than a young girl playing lawyer. Today, she was the founder of her own firm, one dedicated to defending those the system had tried to forget. Behind her, the door swung open, and Elijah Carter stepped out, adjusting his tie. "You're staring at that sign again, aren't you?" he teased. Maya smirked, turning to him. "I worked too hard for this not to stare at it." Elijah chuckled, but there was pride in his eyes. A year ago, he had been a man fighting for his life in a broken system. Today, he was her first official partner, having pursued a career in law after everything they had been through. "I still can't believe you talked me into this," he said, shaking his head. Maya nudged him. "You owe me. If it weren't for me, you'd still be sitting in a prison cell for something you didn't do." He rolled his eyes playfully. All right. You saved my life." "Happy?" Maya laughed. "Very." They walked back inside, the air humming with the energy of something new, something real. The small office was simple. Only a few desks, stacks of legal books, and a whiteboard filled with case notes. But it was theirs. At the receptionist's desk, an older woman looked up and smiled. "Your mother called again," she said to Maya. "She wants to know if you're eating enough." Maya groaned. "She's never going to stop worrying, is she?" Elijah smirked. "Not a chance." Maya picked up the phone, dialing her mother's number. The moment the call connected, her mother's warm voice filled the line. "Baby, are you resting?" Maya grinned. "Mom, we just opened today. I'm fine." "You're always fine, but that doesn't mean you don't need to take care of yourself," her mother said, her tone laced with affection. "I saw the article about your firm. Maya, you are doing something incredible." Maya's chest tightened. "I just want to help people like Elijah, people who deserve better." Her mother exhaled. "And that's why I'm so proud of you." Maya swallowed hard, glancing around the office. There were so many cases waiting for them, so many lives that needed defending. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of the challenge. After hanging up, she turned to Elijah, who was already sifting through paperwork. "All right, boss," he said with a teasing grin. "What's next?" Maya looked out the window, watching as the city lights flickered to life. "Everything," she said softly. "Everything's next." Later that night, Maya found herself back on the rooftop of her apartment. The city stretched out before her. The weight of everything, the fight, the victories, the losses settled in her chest. She thought about the girl she had been a year ago. The one who had walked into that courtroom and been met with laughter, with doubt. That girl had been strong. But the woman she had become, she was unstoppable. She closed her eyes, letting the night air fill her lungs. She had spent her whole life proving herself, but now she didn't need to. She belonged. She always had. And nothing, no judge, no system, no amount of doubt would ever take that away from her again. As she stood there, a quiet certainty settled over her. This was just the beginning